3 weeks before my divorce hearing, I sat behind the wheel of our SUV in a restaurant parking lot and listened to my husband explain, in careful, practiced sentences. He'd left his phone in the center console when he went inside to check on our reservation, still close enough to the car that it never dropped its Bluetooth connection. 2 minutes later, when Priya called, the car answered it automatically, the way it always did for both of us. He didn't know I was still sitting there. He didn't know the call was playing straight through the speakers, 2 feet from my hand, filling the whole cabin like he was sitting in the passenger seat instead of 40 feet away at a hostess stand. By the time Emma's lawyer finds the accounts, he said, they'll already be in Malta. I heard Priya laugh, short and easy, the kind of laugh you give when something is funny because it's also true. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the volume knob, didn't gasp, didn't do any of the things I imagine people picture when they hear a story like mine. I just sat there in the driver's seat of a car we'd bought together, listening to two people I trusted plan the end of my marriage like it was a logistics problem to be solved before Friday. By the time I understood what I was actually hearing, my hand was already moving on its own. I remember the strange, almost clinical detachment that settled over me while I listened, the way certain kinds of shock apparently work. The mind stepping slightly outside itself to observe rather than feel, because feeling everything at once would have been too much to survive sitting upright in a parking lot. I noticed the smell of the restaurant's exhaust fan drifting through my cracked window, garlic and butter, something that would have made me faintly nauseous. When he finally slid into the driver's seat 2 minutes later, he smiled at me, the way he'd smiled at me for 11 years, and asked if I was ready to order the usual. I said yes. I looked at the menu. I ordered the salmon. I asked about his day, and underneath the table, my phone sat in my lap, screen dark, 6 minutes and 41 seconds of his voice already saved, backed up, and quietly, permanently mine. I don't remember much else about that specific dinner, the actual conversation, what either of us said over the meal itself. My name is Emma Whitfield. I'm 41 years old. He thought I wasn't smart enough to catch it. He wasn't the first man to underestimate a woman who kept quiet while she worked. He was just the first one I loved. To understand how I ended up in that parking lot, and how I ended up 3 weeks later, standing in a courtroom with a recording that would unravel everything he built to hide from me. You have to go back to the beginning, back to a hospital hallway on a Tuesday night in March 13 years ago, when none of this seemed possible. I met Marcus during my second year as a pharmacist, on a night shift that had already gone sideways twice before midnight. He was working security at the hospital then, finishing an MBA during the day and pulling overnight shifts to pay for it, and he used to walk the pharmacy corridor around 3 in the morning with 2 paper cups of coffee, one for whichever nurse or tech looked like they were about to fall asleep on their feet, and one, more often than not, for me. He talked about a company he wanted to build someday, something in freight logistics, a way to make small trucking operations run efficiently, the way big national carriers did, using software instead of guesswork. Most people who talk like that at 3 a.m. in a hospital hallway are talking themselves into believing something they don't quite believe yet. Marcus wasn't. Even then, exhausted, underpaid, running on vending machine coffee, there was a kind of certainty in the way he described it. I believed him before I had any real reason to. I think, if I'm honest, I believed him because I wanted something to believe in too, and his dream was easier to hold on to than building one of my own from scratch. Our first real date, if you could call it that, happened almost by accident. I'd mentioned, in passing, during one of those hallway conversations, that I hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days because of back-to-back shifts, and he showed up the next night with a container of his mother's arroz con palo, still warm, wrapped in 2 kitchen towels to keep the heat in during the drive over. We dated for about a year before he proposed, most of it conducted in the strange, compressed way relationships form when both people are working overnight schedules, snatched dinners at 6 a.m. that felt like our version of a normal evening out, entire relationship milestones happening at hours most couples would consider the middle of the night. He proposed on the roof of his apartment building, the closest thing either of us had to a view, with a ring he'd clearly saved for longer than he probably should have given how little money either of us had at the time. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I remember my mother's reaction when I told her, a mixture of happiness and a very practical kind of worry. We got married 2 years later in my parents' backyard on a budget so tight my mother sewed the tablecloths herself. Marcus didn't have a business yet, not really, just a business plan, 2 secondhand box trucks, and a rented corner of a warehouse he shared with an auto parts distributor. I had my pharmacy license, a steady paycheck, and apparently an inexhaustible willingness to believe that steady was temporary. We made an agreement early on. The first 3 years were brutal in ways that don't translate well into a story people tell at dinner parties. There were months the company brought in almost nothing. There were nights Marcus came home and sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands, ready to shut the whole thing down, and I would pour him another cup of coffee, the same gesture he used to bring me in that hospital hallway, except now it was my turn to carry it, and I'd tell him the same thing every time. "We're going to get through this," I'd say. And somehow, we always did. Sagan, the particle folder, told anyone about, and so it simply lives in me as private memory, rather than case material. Marcus had missed payroll for his one employee at the time, a driver named Hector who had a wife and a new baby, and Marcus came home that night more shaken than would driver. Money I'd always privately thought about Manibi, and Marcus came home that night might pivot to Marcus without much discussion, and he used it to cover Hector's pay that week, and he cried at the kitchen table that week, and he cried at the kitchen table that night. I was nothing shameful about needing help to close a tablet with the time. I worked overtime almost every week those years, picking up shifts other pharmacists didn't want. Holidays, weekends, anything that paid a differential. My paycheck covered our mortgage, our health insurance, our groceries, and more than once, when an investor pulled out at the last minute or a client payment came in late, it covered payroll for Marcus's two employees as well. I postponed the clinical pharmacology certification I'd always wanted, the kind that would have let me specialize instead of dispensing prescriptions for the rest of my career, because we couldn't afford the tuition and my overtime hours at the same time, and something had to give. I kept driving a car with over 140,000 miles on it long after it should have been replaced. We didn't take a real vacation for 6 straight years. I remember a specific Thanksgiving during that stretch, our third or fourth married, when we couldn't afford to fly out to see either set of parents, and instead spent the holiday assembling a secondhand desk Marcus needed for the warehouse office, eating turkey sandwiches from the grocery store deli counter because neither of us had the time. The absurdity of spending a holiday building office furniture instead of celebrating a finding difficult side by side, rather than alone. I've had to sit with the fact that memory doesn't lie exactly, which conduinely finding a moment it's had to celebrating an inevitable unraveling. Every sacrifice felt worth it because I believed, the way you believe things you've decided not to examine too closely, that we were building something together. Whenever Marcus thanked me, which he did often in those years, he said the same thing almost every time, like it was a mantra he'd adopted for both of us. One day, all of this will be ours. Somewhere around year 7, the company found its footing in a way that surprised even Marcus. A logistics software feature he'd built almost as an afterthought, a route optimization tool that shaved fuel costs for small trucking fleets, caught the attention of a regional distributor, and within 18 months, Whitfield Freight Solutions had gone from 2 trucks and a warehouse corner to a real operation. Marcus started flying out for logistics conferences twice a month. He was profiled in a regional business magazine. He got invited onto a panel at an industry summit in Chicago. I remember sitting in the audience for that one, watching him talk about supply chain resilience with a confidence I'd watched him build one exhausted night at a time, and feeling. Paya Anand joined the company around that same period, brought on initially as a strategic consultant to help manage the company's rapid growth, and within a year she'd become Marcus's full business partner. I want to be honest about that too, because it complicates the story in a way I think matters. I liked Priya. For the first 2 or 3 years of her involvement with the company, I considered her something close to a friend, someone I texted occasionally about things that had nothing to do with Marcus or the business, restaurant recommendations, a book she'd mentioned enjoying, a birthday message when her father passed away. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as an obvious villain. Sometimes it arrives as someone you genuinely liked, whose company you enjoyed, right up until the moment you understood what she'd actually been doing the whole time. I remember specifically a weekend the two of us spent together at a logistics conference in Austin during the company's 9th year, back when I still occasionally traveled with Marcus to these things, back before the trips became something he took alone. Priya and I ended up sharing a hotel room by accident. I remember staying up past midnight both nights talking, the kind of conversation that builds really to have children given how consumed our lives already were by the company. She told me things that weekend ought I'd see ebb with a tool trilogy grief at how completely someone can hold two entirely contradictory realities toward you at once, apparently already the early architecture of a plan to help irrelity already were by the company. That was also, I understand now, looking back with the clarity that only comes after the fact, around the time everything started quietly coming apart. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment a marriage begins to erode because erosion doesn't announce itself. It doesn't happen in a single dramatic scene. It happens in 1,000 small omissions that only make sense as a pattern once you've already lost most of what they were eating away at. Marcus stopped asking about my day first. Not abruptly, not with any obvious cruelty, just a slow tapering off, the way a habit fades when nobody's tending it. Dinner conversations, which used to be a genuine exchange, became something closer to a briefing, Marcus talking through investor updates and revenue projections and expansion strategy while I nodded and asked the occasional clarifying question, and quietly noticed that he never asked a single one back. He hired assistants for the office that year, 2 of them, to handle scheduling and correspondence he used to handle himself. Somehow, despite that, I was still the one managing everything at home, still the one who remembered to schedule the dentist appointments and renew the car registration and plan whatever family gathering needed planning. When I finally brought up, tentatively, the idea of going back for that clinical pharmacology certification I'd shelved years earlier, Now that we could theoretically afford it, he didn't even look up from his phone. Why? He said. Just the one word, flat, like the question itself was the strange part. I've always wanted it, I told him. You know that. He shrugged. Seems unnecessary now. I didn't push it that night. I told myself it was exhaustion talking, that he'd had a long week, that this wasn't really him. I've thought about that conversation more times than I can count since then, turning it over, wondering what would have happened if I'd pushed harder in that exact moment instead of letting it go. I don't think it would have changed anything. I've spent a lot of time since trying to trace the earlier years more honestly, without the softening that memory does automatically when you've decided to keep loving someone. I remember the winter our furnace went out during the company's third year, right in the middle of a stretch when we genuinely could not afford to replace it. Marcus spent 2 weekends under the crawl space trying to fix it himself, using a manual he printed from the library computer because we didn't have internet fast enough at home to load the video tutorials properly. I remember bringing him coffee down there, the same gesture reversed now, kneeling on the cold concrete floor of the crawl space entrance to hand him a thermos, and him laughing, covered in dust, saying, "This is either going to work or we're moving into your parents' basement." It worked. We celebrated with grocery store cake, the kind with the plastic dome lid. There was another year, the fifth one, when the company almost folded entirely after a major client backed out mid-contract. And Marcus came home one night and told me flatly, exhausted past the point of pride, that he thought it was over, that he'd wasted years of both our lives chasing something that was never going to work. It's strange revisiting memories like that now. They aren't false. That's the part that took me longest to accept in therapy afterward. The business trips became more frequent after that. Conferences that used to happen quarterly started happening monthly. Weekend plans we've made together started getting canceled with increasing regularity, always for reasons that sounded plausible in isolation. A late-breaking client call, an unexpected site visit, a meeting that ran long and turned into dinner and turned into just staying over instead of driving back tonight. Every time I raised a concern, however gently, I got some version of the same response. "You're overthinking it, Em. You worry too much. In peste. It's just work." I wanted to believe that. I want to be honest about how badly I wanted to believe that, because it's easier, when you're telling a story like this after the fact, to make yourself sound sharper and more suspicious than you actually were in the moment. The first crack in that explaining away came on an ordinary Tuesday in what would have been our 11th year, while I was organizing paperwork for our accountant ahead of tax season. I started paying attention after that. None of it, on its own, proved anything. All of it together told a story I didn't want to read. There was a specific weekend, about 8 months before the umbrella incident, that I've come back to often since, because at the time I let myself be talked out of a suspicion that turned out to be entirely correct. Marcus had told me, weeks in advance, that he needed to attend a 3-day supply chain conference in Denver, one he described in enough detail, complete with the names of 2 keynote speakers I later confirmed had never actually been on that year's program, that I never thought to question it. I planned to fly out and join him for the last evening, a small surprise, a chance to get away together the way we hadn't in years. When I called the hotel directly to confirm my own late arrival, the front desk had no reservation under his name for those dates at all. I called Marcus immediately, my voice, I remember, more confused than accusatory. "They're saying you're not booked there," I told him. "I switched hotels last minute," he said without missing a beat, an explanation delivered with a kind of practiced ease that should have told me something on its own. Naomi tried to warn me, gently, months before I found anything concrete myself. We were having lunch, the two of us, at a place near the hospital we'd been going to since before either of us was married, and she asked carefully. I told her things were fine. There was one direct conversation about 4 months before the umbrella where I came as close as I ever had to confronting him outright, without yet having the language or the evidence to make the confrontation land. We were in the kitchen late, both of us tired, and I asked him, plainly, whether there was something going on with Priya beyond the business. I remember watching his face very closely as I asked, looking for whatever a lie looks like on someone you've loved for a decade. "Where is this coming from?" he asked. And the question itself, the redirection of it back onto me rather than an actual answer, should have told me everything. I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid, that success had simply changed the rhythm of our marriage in ways that felt, from the inside, uncomfortably similar to distance without actually being infidelity. I wanted, more than I wanted to be right, for that explanation to be true. It wasn't, but I didn't have proof yet, and without proof, I didn't feel entitled to trust my own instincts over his direct denial. "He's filing for divorce in Q-Wid," it read, "told him to wait until the Kessler acquisition closes, so nothing's traceable to the marital estate." I've replayed that exact moment more times than I can count. I remember the umbrella was still in my hand. I remember the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower somewhere down the block. I remember thinking, with a kind of strange, detached clarity, that the sentence didn't even sound like it was written about me, like it was describing some abstract legal category called the marital estate, rather than a house and a life and 11 years I'd spent believing in something. I put the umbrella down. I didn't say anything. I took a photo of the screen before it could lock, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and then I closed the car door and walked back inside to finish getting ready for dinner, because his mother was turning 72, and I wasn't going to be the reason that evening fell apart. Not yet, not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. That was the moment, if I have to name one, when I stopped being a wife trying to save her marriage and became a woman building a case. I don't say that with any pride. It's simply the most accurate description I have for the shift that happened inside me that afternoon. Something closed. Something else, quieter and colder and far more useful, opened in its place. I want to be careful about how I describe the weeks that followed, because it would be easy, telling the story now, to make it sound like I transformed overnight into some kind of tactical genius, calmly assembling a legal case with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. That isn't what it felt like. What it felt like was grief wearing the costume of competence. Because grief, in my experience, doesn't always announce itself as tears. The first thing I did before anything else, before I let myself feel any of what I was feeling, was find out whether the state we lived in was a one-party consent state for recorded conversations. I needed to know that before I recorded a single thing, because I wasn't going to build an entire case on evidence a judge could throw out on a technicality in 30 seconds. It was. Then I started documenting. Not accusing, not confronting, just documenting, the way you'd catalog evidence for someone else's case rather than your own, because keeping that emotional distance was the only way I could function. I kept a small digital recorder in my bag during the team dinners where Marcus and Priya discussed logistics that, increasingly, didn't sound much like logistics whenever I happened to overhear a fragment. I saved every calendar invite that didn't match what Marcus had told me verbally. I forwarded myself copies of emails from our shared cloud drive before he had the chance to delete them. There was a night, about 5 weeks into that documentation period, when I came closer to being caught than I ever let myself think about too directly afterward. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, opening the refrigerator, his back to me. "Just catching up on some filing," I said, and I remember the strange, dissociated calm in my own voice, like I was listening to someone else answer for me. "You know how I get before tax season." He didn't look twice. He poured a glass of water, said something about an early call the next morning, and went back upstairs. I sat at that table for another 20 minutes after he left, not moving, watching my own hands to see if they were shaking. They weren't, which surprised me more than anything else that night. I told Claire about that night the next day, on the phone during my lunch break, sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage because it was the only place I could talk without being overheard. "I don't recognize myself right now," I told her. "I don't know if that's a good thing or a terrible thing." "Maybe it's both," she said. "Maybe you get to decide which one it becomes later, once this part is over." I've thought about that answer often since. The documentation itself, once I really committed to it, took on a rhythm of its own, almost clinical in its repetitiveness, which I think is part of what allowed me to keep doing it without collapsing under the emotional weight of what I was actually documenting. Every Sunday evening after Marcus had gone to bed, I'd spend an hour cataloging whatever I gathered that week, cross-referencing dates against the calendar he shared with me, building a timeline in a document I kept encrypted and backed up in 3 separate places, because by then I'd learned enough from Denise about how these cases could unravel on technicalities that I wasn't willing to leave anything to chance. I learned things about my own capacity for patience during those weeks that I hadn't known before. There was one particular dinner at a restaurant downtown that Marcus and Priya used regularly enough that I'd started to recognize the hostess's face, where I overheard, through the recorder in my bag, roughly 4 minutes of a conversation about restructuring the company's ownership documentation to reflect actual contribution. A phrase that meant nothing to me in the moment, but that Richard Voss, the Bluetooth call outside the restaurant, the one I told you about at the very beginning, was the piece that finally connected everything else into a single coherent picture. Marcus explaining to Priya, in his own words, in detail so specific, I didn't need to infer anything, exactly how he intended to route company distributions through a shell entity registered in Malta before the divorce filing went through, so that none of it would ever be traceable to our marital estate for the purposes of asset division. I sat in that driver's seat for 11 more minutes after the call ended, just breathing, before Marcus walked back out to the car, like nothing had happened, smiling at me the same way he'd smiled at me for 11 years. I hired an attorney the following morning. Her name was Denise Okafor, a family law attorney a colleague from the hospital had once mentioned in passing, someone who specialized specifically in cases involving hidden or concealed marital assets. I didn't call ahead. Denise looked through it for a long time without saying anything. When she finally looked up, she said something I've thought about often since. She walked me through that first afternoon exactly what she needed from me going forward, and I remember being struck by how methodical she made it sound, how she managed to translate the most painful thing that had ever happened to me into a series of concrete, achievable tasks. "You're not going to confront him," she told me. "Confrontation gives him time to move things, delete things, get his story straight with his attorney before we've locked anything down." I told her I could. I wasn't entirely sure in that moment whether it was true. It turned out to be true, though it cost more than I expected it to. Over the following weeks, while Denise and I built a legal case quietly in the background, Marcus's life on the surface continued exactly as it had before, which was, in its own way, the strangest part of that entire period. He still came home most nights. I also started, during that period, keeping a private journal, separate from the case documentation, something Dr. Patel later told me was a healthier instinct than I gave myself credit for at the time. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't organized. It was just a place to put the parts of what I was feeling that didn't belong in a legal file: the exhaustion, the grief, the strange flashes of tenderness that kept surfacing even after everything I'd learned, the particular loneliness of grieving a marriage while still living inside it every single day. I still have that journal. Mutual friends started calling me during that stretch too, the way they do once a marriage starts showing hairline cracks that everyone can sense before anyone says anything out loud. My friend Naomi, who'd known us both since before we were married, called one evening sounding hesitant in a way that wasn't like her. "I don't know if I should tell you this," she said, "but Marcus told Tom he's filing soon. He said you'd be lucky to walk away with the house." I thanked her for telling me. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't ask her to relay any message back. I'd learned by then that the truth doesn't need volume behind it. It just needs somewhere official to land eventually. Marcus hired one of the most well-regarded divorce attorneys in the city, a man named Gregory Hale, who had a reputation for aggressive asset protection strategies, the kind of attorney business owners hire specifically because they're worried about exactly the sort of documentation I was quietly assembling against him. I remember Denise mentioning his name the first time with something close to a smile. There was a moment, about 6 weeks before the filing, when I almost lost my nerve. I remember opening my laptop that night, pulling up the encrypted case file I'd been building for months, and sitting there for almost an hour without touching anything, just looking at the folder names, thinking about how strange it was that 11 years of shared life had come down to a series of labeled documents on a hard drive. What pulled me out of it, more than anything Claire said on the phone later that night, was a smaller, quieter memory that surfaced almost on its own while I sat there. I thought about the $4,000 for my grandmother's account, the one I'd handed over without hesitation to save Hector's paycheck all those years earlier, and I thought about how easily, how completely, I had always given whatever was asked of me in that marriage, without ever once, in 11 years, stopping to ask whether the same generosity was being extended back. I called my sister that night, the only person besides Denise who knew the full extent of what I'd found. Her name is Claire, 4 years younger than me, a school teacher with a bluntness I've always envied. "You're allowed to still love him and still do this," she told me. "Those aren't opposites, Em. They just feel like they should be." I didn't fully believe her that night. I believe her now. There was a second, smaller wave of doubt about 10 days later, this one triggered by nothing more dramatic than Marcus bringing home flowers on an ordinary Tuesday, no occasion attached the way he used to when we were first married and money was too tight to justify flowers, but he bought them anyway, or whether it was simply guilt finding its usual outlet in a bouquet from the grocery store. I never found out which it was. I put the flowers in water, thanked him, and went upstairs that night to Evie simply guilt finding its usual outlet in a bouquet from the grocery store. I never found out which it was simply any single dramatic moment, was the actual texture of that period. Not one clean break, but months of living simultaneously inside two of the case timeline. Marcus filed for divorce almost exactly 2 months after the Bluetooth call, timed, just as Priya had instructed him. The weeks between the filing and the hearing were in their own way harder than anything that came before. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from maintaining two entirely separate emotional realities at once. The private one, where I understood exactly what was happening to me, and the public one, where friends and family asked cautious, sympathetic questions, and I had to decide, moment by moment, how much of the truth I was allowed to share before it compromised the case Denise and I were building. I told almost no one the full story. Even my parents only knew the broad outline, that the marriage was ending. Denise and I met nearly every week during that stretch, refining what she called the narrative architecture of the case, deciding which pieces of evidence to present when and how, which documents needed additional authentication before they'd be admissible, which forensic accounting steps we needed to formally request through discovery to corroborate what I'd already found on my own. She brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet, meticulous man named Richard Voss, who specialized in tracing exactly the kind of shell entity structure Marcus had described on that recording. Richard spent 3 weeks going through publicly available corporate registries. Denise noted it. She noted everything. There was a mandatory mediation session about 5 weeks before the hearing, required by the court before either side could proceed to a contested trial. Marcus barely spoke during the session. I didn't say much during the mediation either, on Denise's advice. Let them make their offer, she told me beforehand. You don't owe them a reaction. I remember Marcus looking at me once near the end of the session, an expression on his face I couldn't quite read, somewhere between guilt and irritation, and I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me that I no longer needed to understand what that expression meant. It wasn't my job anymore to interpret him. The mediation ended without agreement, which Denise told me afterward was, given everything we had, exactly the outcome she'd expected and, in some ways, hoped for. A settlement now would have meant settling before they knew what we knew, she said. This way, they walk into that courtroom with no idea what's coming. My own deposition happened about 2 weeks later, and Denise spent the 2 evenings beforehand preparing me for it with a thoroughness that, at the time, felt almost excessive, though I understood by the end exactly why she'd insisted on it. We sat at her conference table running through the kind of questions Gregory Hale was likely to ask, questions designed less to uncover new facts than to make me sound, on the record, less credible or more emotionally compromised than the documents themselves suggested. He's going to ask if you were angry when you found the text message on the umbrella day, she told me. Don't minimize it and don't perform it either. Just answer honestly and stop talking. The instinct to fill silence is the thing that gets people in trouble. The actual deposition when it happened was almost anticlimactic compared to how much I'd braced for it. Gregory Hale spent a long time trying to establish that my documentation effort had been driven by suspicion and jealousy rather than legitimate concern, a line of questioning Denise had warned me about almost word for word. Marcus's deposition happened about 3 weeks after mine, in a conference room at Gregory Hale's firm, with Denise conducting the questioning and a court reporter transcribing every word. He was asked directly whether he discussed offshore asset structuring with anyone outside the company's normal legal counsel, she told me. He said no, on the record, under oath, 3 weeks after we already had a recording establishing the opposite. I asked her what that meant, practically. It means, she said, that when we play that recording in court, it isn't just going to contradict his financial disclosures. It's going to contradict sworn deposition testimony. That's a very different kind of problem for him. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before my alarm, the way you do before something you've been dreading and preparing for in equal measure for months. I lay in bed for a while in the gray half-light before sunrise, running through the timeline in my head, one more time even though I'd long since memorized every date on it, the way you check a stove burner you already know is off, just to be certain. I made coffee I didn't really want, ate half a piece of toast I didn't finish, and stood in front of my closet for longer than the decision deserved. I remember the parking garage more clearly than almost anything else from that morning, the particular echo of my own footsteps on the concrete, the way my hands felt cold despite the mild weather, the strange, disconnected sensation of being a person who did ordinary things like feed a parking meter on the same morning she was about to try to prove, in a room full of strangers that her husband had spent years lying to her. Are you doing okay? She asked. I'm done being scared of this, I told her, and I meant it mostly. I just want it to be over. She studied me for a moment, the way she always did before a hearing. Checking, I think, less for confidence and more for whether I was steady enough to sit through what was coming without flinching. Inside, the courthouse had the particular hush that public buildings take on early in the morning, before the day's business has fully started, footsteps echoing slightly off marble floors, the low murmur of other people's cases being discussed in hallway corners. I remember passing a young couple sitting together outside a different courtroom, holding hands, clearly there for something happier than what had brought me, and feeling a brief, strange pang of something I couldn't quite name, not envy exactly, more a kind of distant recognition of a version of hope I no longer had easy access to. We walked in together. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, in a suit I didn't recognize, tailored in a way our household budget, even now, wouldn't have easily accommodated. I learned much later, through the forensic accounting process. He sat down beside Gregory Hale without looking at me. Gregory Hale opened first, his tone confident, almost bored, the tone of a man who has given this particular kind of opening statement dozens of times and expects this instance to go exactly the same way as all the others. Your Honor, he said, Mr. Whitfield built Whitfield Freight Solutions from nothing but a business plan and 2 second-hand trucks. Marcus nodded along, small and satisfied. and in the gallery, Priya allowed herself the thinnest, most confident smile. I remember sitting through that opening statement with a strange, almost clinical calm, listening to a man describe 11 years of my life as merely supportive, a word chosen. I understood even then, specifically to make my contribution sound decorative rather than load-bearing. I'd expected, in the weeks leading up to the hearing, that hearing it out loud in a courtroom might land differently than it had in mediation, might finally break through whatever composure I'd built up over the preceding months. It didn't. I think by that point, I'd simply run out of capacity to be surprised by how easily people could rewrite a shared history once they decided it was inconvenient. Denise had warned me during our final preparation session 2 days earlier exactly how the opening statements would likely unfold. Denise stood. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. "Your Honor," she said, "before we address asset classification, we'd like to submit Exhibit 14. The judge, a woman named Alvarez with a reputation, Denise had told me beforehand, for being unusually thorough with financial disclosures, looked up from her notes. "An audio recording, Your Honor, along with a certified transcript prepared by a court-approved forensic audio examiner." Gregory Hale stood immediately. "I'll hear it first," Judge Alvarez said, not unkindly but with a finality that ended the objection before it could fully form. "Then I'll rule on admissibility based on what I hear and the certification provided." Denise pressed play. The recording filled the courtroom, Marcus's voice unmistakable, calm and methodical, explaining the Malta routing structure in his own words, discussing timelines relative to the divorce filing, discussing explicitly the intent to move company distributions offshore specifically so they would not be traceable to the marital estate. Judge Alvarez removed her glasses. "Counsel," she said, addressing Gregory Hale directly, "is that your client's voice on this recording?" Hale hesitated, glancing sideways at Marcus before answering. "Your Honor, we need time to review the recording's chain of custody before we can." "Is that his voice, or isn't it?" A longer pause this time. "It appears to be, Your Honor." Denise continued, her tone unchanged, still calm, still unhurried, as though she were reading a grocery list rather than dismantling a marriage's financial defense in real time. "Your Honor, we also have banking records obtained through the standard discovery process showing a consulting payment of $180,000 from Whitfield Freight Solutions to Anand Strategic Partners, a firm owned by Imspriya Anand, dated 11 days after the conversation you just heard." She placed each document on the bench as she named it, one at a time, deliberate, unhurried, letting the paper itself do the talking. Judge Alvarez reviewed the documents in silence for what felt, sitting there, like an extraordinarily long time, though Denise told me afterward it was closer to 4 minutes. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out for what felt like a full 10 seconds. "I? There were legitimate business reasons for structuring the international. That wasn't my question, Mr. Whitfield." Judge Alvarez's voice stayed level. Another pause, shorter this time, but heavier. "Yes." Denise wasn't finished. She called Richard Voss to the stand to speak to his preliminary findings, and I watched Gregory Hale's posture shift as Richard walked to the witness box, folder in hand, the unhurried gait of a man who had done this exact thing dozens of times before and had no particular investment in how anyone in the room felt about what he was about to say. "Mr. Voss," Denise began, "can you describe in general terms what a registered agent service like the one used to form the Malta entity typically indicates?" "It typically indicates," Richard said, "that the person forming the entity sought a jurisdiction and a structure specifically chosen to minimize traceability to their existing assets. And based on your review so far, does the timeline in this case align with that pattern?" "It does," Richard said. "The entity was formed 6 days before the filing date. The consulting payment to Anand Strategic Partners occurred 11 days after the recorded conversation submitted as Exhibit 14. Gregory Hale stood for cross-examination, visibly trying to recover some of the ground his side had lost in the preceding 20 minutes. "It is," Richard agreed evenly. "So you can't say with certainty that this particular structure was created solely to conceal assets from Mrs. Whitfield, correct?" "I can't speak to certainty about intent," Richard said. "I can speak to timeline, and the timeline here is unusual. Most legitimate international tax structuring isn't formed 6 days before a divorce filing by the same individual whose voice, on a separate recording already admitted into evidence, explicitly describes the purpose as keeping funds untraceable to the marital estate." Hale had no immediate response to that. He sat back down a moment later, and I remembered Denise glancing at me briefly, the closest thing to a private acknowledgement she allowed herself during the entire hearing, before returning her attention to the bench. Denise had also subpoenaed Priya to testify, a strategic decision she'd explained to me beforehand as a calculated risk, since Priya was a hostile witness with every incentive to minimize what she said, but one whose testimony, contradicted by the recording already in evidence, could do more damage under cross-examination than almost any other piece of evidence we had left. Priya walked to the stand with far more composure than Marcus had managed, and for a moment, watching her settle into the witness box, smoothing her jacket with the same unbothered confidence I remembered from all those years of trusting her, I felt something twist uncomfortably in my chest, some last remnant of the friendship I genuinely believed existed between us. Ms. Anand, Denise began, can you describe your role at Whitfield Freight Solutions? I'm a strategic partner and minority equity holder, Priya said, her voice level. I've been with the company for approximately 6 years. And what is Anand Strategic Partners? My independent of Whitfield Freight Solutions? Yes. Denise let that answer sit in the room for a moment before continuing. Ms. Anand, there was a pause, longer than the one Marcus had given, but I watched something in Priya's expression shift, the composure holding on the surface while something underneath it visibly recalculated. I didn't ask about context, Ms. Anand. I asked whether you recognize the voice as your own. Another pause. Similar, Denise repeated, not quite a question, letting the word do its own work in front of the judge. Ms. Anand, did you advise Mr. Whitfield to delay the divorce filing until after the Kessler acquisition closed? I don't recall giving specific legal advice regarding the timing of. I didn't ask about legal advice. I asked whether you personally advised him on the timing. Priya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack I'd seen in her composure since she'd taken the stand. And did those discussions include the effect of that timing on how the marital estate would be calculated? A longer silence this time. Judge Alvarez glanced up from her notes, waiting. I believe the topic came up, Priya finally said. Denise nodded, unhurried, and moved to the next document. Anand Strategic Partners received a payment of $180,000 from Whitfield Freight Solutions, 11 days after the conversation captured in Exhibit 14. General strategic advisory work, Priya said, related to the company's expansion planning. Do you have documentation of the specific deliverables associated with that payment? I would need to review our files. The court has already requested those files through discovery, Ms. Anand. None were provided. Priya didn't answer that one at all. Judge Alvarez made another note, and I watched Priya's eyes flick, briefly, toward Marcus, an expression passing between them that looked less like solidarity than something closer to mutual silent panic. Judge Alvarez turned back to Marcus directly after Priya stepped down. Mr. Whitfield, I want to give you the opportunity to clarify anything about your deposition testimony from 3 weeks ago, in which you stated under oath that you had not discussed offshore asset structuring with anyone outside the company's standard legal counsel. Does that testimony still reflect your position? I watched Gregory Hale lean toward Marcus and say something too quiet for the rest of the room to hear. Marcus sat with it for a long moment before answering. No, Your Honor, he said finally. It doesn't. I see, Judge Alvarez said, and made a note that I imagine, though I never confirmed it, ended up mattering a great deal in whatever came next for him professionally, separate from the divorce itself. Judge Alvarez set the documents down and addressed both attorneys directly. This court takes attempts to conceal marital assets from equitable distribution extremely seriously. I'm ordering a full forensic accounting of Whitfield Freight Solutions, including all transactions with Anand Strategic Partners over the preceding 18 months, to be conducted by a court-appointed examiner. I'm also referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for review of possible perjury regarding the financial disclosures already filed with this court under Mr. Whitfield's signature, as well as regarding the deposition testimony just addressed. She looked toward me then, for the first time that entire morning. Mrs. Whitfield. Marcus didn't look at me as the hearing adjourned. Priya had already slipped out of the gallery before the judge finished her final sentence, moving quickly enough that her exit felt like its own kind of confession. Naomi was waiting for me on the courthouse steps, having sat through the entire hearing in the back row exactly as I'd noticed earlier, and she hugged me the moment I walked out, not saying anything at first, just holding on longer than either of us usually did. I've never watched anything like that in my life, she finally said, pulling back to look at me. The forensic accounting process that followed took just over 10 weeks. I didn't spend those weeks celebrating because there was nothing yet to celebrate, only a long, uncertain waiting period punctuated by occasional updates from Denise, each one adding another layer of detail to a picture I already understood in its broad outlines but hadn't yet seen in full. I went back to work almost immediately after the hearing, partly because I needed the income and partly because the routine of it About 6 weeks into the forensic accounting process, Denise called with news I hadn't anticipated. A former employee of Whitfield Freight Solutions, a mid-level accountant named Jason Reyes who had left the company 8 months earlier under what he described at the time as philosophical differences, he wants to testify, Denise told me. Voluntarily, he said he's had trouble sleeping since he saw the story. I remember feeling something complicated when she told me that, gratitude mixed with a strange, quiet sadness, the recognition that there had been other people inside that company who'd seen pieces of what was happening and hadn't known what to do with it either, carrying their own version of the discomfort I'd carried for those long months of documentation. Once at Denise's office, when he came in to formally hand over the documents he'd kept. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, visibly uncomfortable in the way of someone unaccustomed to being at the center of anything. I should have said something before I left, he told me, not quite meeting my eyes. I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I was misreading it. I told him he didn't owe me an apology, that most people, faced with the same choice, quietly protect themselves rather than a stranger's marriage, and that the fact he'd come forward at all, even 8 months late, mattered more than the delay. What the court-appointed examiner eventually found, combined with Jason Reyes's corroborating records, was, even accounting for what I already knew, worse than I'd expected. There was a secondary consequence neither Marcus nor Priya had anticipated, one that Denise told me later she suspected, but hadn't wanted to promise me in advance in case it didn't materialize. Kessler Regional Freight's compliance department, conducting its own routine post-acquisition review, caught wind of the ongoing fraud investigation through a public court filing and, within weeks, formally withdrew from several remaining integration agreements tied to the acquisition, citing concerns about the financial integrity of Whitfield Freight Solutions leadership. The deal that Marcus had timed his entire concealment strategy around, the deal Priya had told him to wait for specifically because it would make the eventual. The final settlement hearing was, in almost every practical sense, an anticlimax after everything that had come before it. There was no dramatic reveal this time, no recording played for the first time in front of a stunned gallery. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered from the first hearing, or perhaps it simply felt that way because so much less was uncertain by then. Gregory Hale sat beside Marcus with a kind of resigned professionalism that had replaced his earlier confidence entirely, a man doing his job competently for a client whose case had. Judge Alvarez simply reviewed the completed forensic report, confirmed the findings against the previously submitted evidence, and issued her ruling in a tone that felt, after everything, almost gentle by comparison. The marital estate, she determined, included the full value of Whitfield Freight Solutions' growth during our marriage. The concealed $600,000 was ordered restored to the estate for division. Marcus sat through that final hearing with none of the confidence he'd walked in with months earlier. I want to be honest about something, because it would be easy, telling a story like this, to let the ending sound triumphant in a way that flattens what it actually felt like living through it. I didn't feel triumphant when the final settlement came through. I felt tired, deeply, thoroughly tired, in a way that took months to fully recover from. I felt relief, the specific kind of relief that comes only after you've been holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten what normal breathing felt like. But triumph, the kind you see in movies, the fist pump and walk away, in slow motion kind, never showed up. What showed up instead was quieter, and I think ultimately more honest. Marcus reached out to me once, several months after the settlement was finalized. As it turned out, though, for a brief moment, when I saw his name on my phone, some old, worn-down part of me hoped that's what it might be. I didn't respond. I sat with the voicemail for a full day before deciding definitively that I wasn't going to call back. Some people, I've come to understand, with the settlement finalized, I did something I'd put off for over a decade. I enrolled in the clinical pharmacology certification program I'd shelved all those years ago, back when Marcus's company needed every spare hour I had and the tuition felt like an impossible luxury. I finished it in 14 months, working full-time throughout, and I now oversee medication safety audits across 3 regional hospital systems, work I find most days genuinely meaningful in a way my old dispensing role, however important, never quite was. I still remember my first week in the new role, sitting across a conference table from a hospital administrator twice my age. The move out of the house happened gradually rather than all at once, which surprised me at the time, though Denise told me that was fairly typical in cases with a long asset division process. I spent one Saturday in late autumn packing books into boxes in a house that no longer felt like mine, room by room, deciding what belonged to the marriage and what belonged. Going forward only to me, I kept the small kitchen table where we used to sit during the company's early years. The one where I'd poured him coffee, the one where he'd told me coffee, the one where he'd told me near the end. That graduate school seemed unnecessary now. I almost left it behind out of some instinct to leave everything associated with that version of my life in the past where it belonged. I started seeing a therapist about 2 months after the hearing. Someone Naomi had recommended, a woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized, among other things, in helping people process the specific disorientation that comes after leaving a long relationship built on a foundation that turned out to be partly false. It means you adapted to an impossible situation, she told me. That's not the same as becoming someone dishonest. You were protecting yourself inside a relationship where honesty had already stopped being mutual. I didn't fully believe her the first time she said it. I believe her now most days. There was another session several months into that process where Dr. Patel asked me a question I hadn't expected and didn't have a ready answer for. "What do you miss?" she asked, not about the marriage broadly, but specifically pressing past the easy, understandable grief over betrayal into something harder to name. I sat with that question for the rest of the session, mostly in silence before finally admitting that I missed the version of the story where the sacrifices had meant what I believed them to mean, not necessarily Marcus himself, not by that point, but the shape of a life where 11 years of showing up for someone had been reciprocated rather than exploited. She didn't try to talk me out of that grief or rush me past it. She simply let it exist in the room, which more than almost any I also worked over those months on something Dr. Patel called separating the decade from the discovery, the practice of holding the genuinely good years, the furnace, the kitchen table, the years of real partnership, as true and worth keeping in memory, without letting the ending retroactively poison every single thing that came before it. Telling our wider circle of friends what had actually happened. Once the case became part of the public record and I no longer needed to protect the confidentiality of an ongoing legal strategy, was its own strange process. Some people reacted with the kind of immediate, uncomplicated support I'd hoped for. Others reacted in ways that surprised me, not maliciously, but with a kind of discomfort that I came to understand had more to do with their own marriages than with mine. A woman I'd known since college, someone I would have described, before all this, as one of my closer friends, told me, gently but unmistakably, that she found the whole story a little intense the same way, that maybe some things were better left to lawyers rather than personal surveillance. It understood later that she and her own husband had financial arrangements neither of them looked at very closely, and that my story had made something uncomfortable visible to her that she hadn't hold it against her. See, I didn't hold it against her. See, I didn't hold. My parents took the news the way I expected them to. My mother furious in the specific, controlled way she gets furious. My father mostly quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he was recalculating everything he thought he'd understood about the son-in-law he'd genuinely liked for over a decade. My father, true to form, said very little in the immediate aftermath, but drove out unannounced one Saturday about a month after the settlement, showing up at my new apartment with a truck bed full of secondhand furniture he'd apparently been collecting from estate sales for weeks without telling me, including, almost unbearably, a small kitchen table not unlike the one I'd kept from the house, as though some part of him understood without either of us sent to me. He told me any of the old weight with it. We spent the whole afternoon, Ascent and me told me, a version of that particular inn, near silence. About a year after the final settlement, I ran into an old acquaintance at a grocery store, someone who'd known Marcus and me only casually, back when the company was still two trucks and a warehouse corner, someone who clearly hadn't heard the full story and asked, with genuine innocence, how Marcus and the business were doing. I remember standing there in the cereal aisle, deciding in real time how much of the actual untrue without being unkind. "We're divorced," I told her. "I'm doing well, though." She looked a little startled, said she was sorry to hear it, and I remember driving home afterward, thinking about how sorry to hear it. About a year after the final settlement, I ran into an old acquaintance at a grocery store, someone who'd known Marcus and me only casually, back when the company was still two trucks and a warehouse corner, someone who clearly hadn't heard the full story and asked, with genuine innocence, how Marcus and the business were doing. I remember standing there in the cereal aisle, deciding in the end on something brief and true without being unkind. The perjury referral Judge Alvarez had ordered during the hearing eventually resulted in a formal investigation by the district attorney's office, separate from the divorce proceeding itself, though Denise cautioned me early on not to expect the same speed or certainty from a criminal referral that we'd gotten from the family court process. Woodfield Freight Solutions survived the fallout, technically, though in a diminished form that Marcus, I suspect, never fully recovered from professionally. Priya's firm, Anand Strategic Partners, was formally dissolved within the year, following the fraud finding and the accompanying loss of its primary client relationship with Whitfield Freight Solutions. I heard secondhand, through mutual acquaintances I've mostly let drift out of my life since, that she relocated out of state not long after. People ask me sometimes when this story comes up whether the recording was really about revenge. I understand why they ask. It's a natural question, given how the story ends. But I don't think it was, not really, and I've had a long time to sit with the distinction. I spent 11 years measuring my own worth by how well I supported someone else's ambition, believing, without ever quite examining the belief closely enough to question it, that the sacrifices I made were an investment in a shared future rather than simply a gift I kept giving without reciprocation. I don't believe that anymore. I don't think I fully understood how deeply I'd absorbed that belief until I watched it get dismantled, piece by piece, in a courtroom, by a judge reading dates off a timeline I'd built with my own hands over months of quiet, careful documentation. There's a version of this story I could tell that ends with a neat lesson about vigilance, about always keeping your own financial records separate, about never fully merging your identity into someone else's ambition. I've heard people draw exactly that lesson from stories like mine, and I understand the impulse. But I don't think that's quite right, or at least it isn't the whole of it. The years I spent supporting Marcus weren't a mistake I'd undo if I could go back. They were real. The partnership for a long time was real. What went wrong wasn't that I trusted too much in the early years. What went wrong is that I kept extending that same trust past the point where it was still being reciprocated, and it took me longer than it should have to notice the exact moment the exchange. I've had to relearn. The night the settlement was finalized, I sat alone in the apartment I'd moved into during the proceedings, a small one, bedroom about 15 minutes from the hospital, nothing like the house Marcus and I had shared, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. They were wrong about that, too. If there's a single thing I'd want someone listening to this to take away, it's not a lesson about recording devices or one party consent laws, though I understand why those details tend to stick in people's memory. I didn't walk out of that courtroom feeling like I'd won something. I walked out feeling like, for the first time in years, the record finally matched the truth. That turned out to be enough. It turned out, in the end, to be more than enough.